Yuji and Ichigo are great protagonists. They also happen to come from Jujutsu Kaisen and Bleach, two great series that have anime airing right now. So just like I have in the past with Yuji and other protagonists, I want to look at what he and Ichigo both do in order to garner the favor of so many people. And by the end of the video, I'd like to give you an answer to why we love Yuji and Ichigo. I've talked about Yuji and Ichigo individually on the channel before. I've even talked about Yuji and Denji and what makes them so likable, but the interesting thing about discussions, comparisons, and breakdowns such as these is that you can always plug in different information and get a completely different conclusion. With Yuji and Ichigo particularly as a pair, I will say one common point that they have that I really enjoy is their goals. They aren't the same per se, but they do somewhat mirror one another. In the same way becoming the #1 hero, becoming the Wizard King, and becoming the Hokage all exist in the same dimension, Yuji and Ichigo's overarching goals are quite similar when put side to side. Ichigo doesn't want to become the Soul King or Captain Commander of the Gote 13. He just wants the strength to protect all of his loved ones without trouble. The enjoyment of fighting in the pursuit of strength is something that Ichigo must strive for his entire journey throughout the series, and Yuji seems to be going down a very similar path. Rather than wanting to become the strongest sorcerer, Yuji wants to save people, die a proper death, and make sure to take Sukuna with him. The most obvious connection between these two that you can make is their desire to save people, and in both instances, that desire comes from a rather unhealthy place. And while we'll talk about the tragic core of their characters later in this video, even the fact that neither of these two have overtly ambitious attitudes is a connection that can be made between them that isn't found in every other protagonist. Now, oftentimes, especially with Ichigo, people mistake a lack of bold declarations for having no goals, no dreams, and no ambitions. And while on a surface level, I could see how one would perceive Ichigo and Yuji as such, when peeling back the layers of both of their characters, or even just acknowledging what has to change about both of them in order to achieve their larger objective, you can tell that Ichigo and Yuji alike do have very obvious goals. They are simply achieved and sought after in a very roundabout way. For these two, strength is just a means to an end. Fighting is just a means to an end. Violence is just a means to an end. Neither of these two particularly seek out conflict, and neither of them want to have to fight to grow stronger, but the fact of the matter, especially in their universes, is that they do. Being able to protect or save people requires strength. True strength is honed in battle, and in order to survive battle, you must be ready for it at all times. This is why Yuji asked for Gojo to make him strong. This is why Ichigo asks Sangetsu for strength. Through their sufferings and hardships, they realize that enveloping themselves in conflict for the sake of others is the only way to preserve their safety. Yuji loses to the like of the finger-bearer curse spirit and has to rely on Sukuna's strength to bail him out. Ichigo loses to Ukiura and Byakuya and has to rely on White to bail him out both times. All of these moments were caused by a lack of ability on the protagonist's part, and because of that, they were punished. Ichigo's punishment came in the way of suppressing his own power and abilities because of his fear of letting White take over. Yuji's punishment came in the way of dying and being forced to make a binding vow with Sukuna. A large part of both of these characters' growth is predicated on their fundamental initial misunderstanding about what having their goal really means. Ichigo and Yuji both have a misconception about their own abilities and what is required of them in order to save and protect. This naivete is met with confrontation and forces them to change as a result. This is a concept that you'll find in just about any character with meaningful depth and development. The lie that a particular person believes must be corrected at some point in order for them to find the presented truth given to us through the narrative. Naruto needs to become an empathetic and respectable person to become the Hokage. It isn't simply about strength, nor is becoming the Hokage about gaining the acceptance of those around you. Being the Hokage means you are already accepted by those around you. Luffy needs to become stronger and a more competent leader to become the Pirate King. Freedom isn't simply granted to those who want it, it's taken by those who are strong enough to fight for it. In a similar fashion, Yuji and Ichigo both need to understand what has to happen in order for them to progress progress and get closer to their goals. This particular trajectory, the idea of a character who has to pick up a sword or swing their fist purely for the sake of others, is really cool, and it's a massive reason that these two have a similar vibe to all of those who find themselves enthralled with both Bleach and Jujutsu Kaisen. Now, taking just a brief step back in tone before talking about a more serious character trait of theirs, I'd like to highlight a little connection I just caught while in the process of writing this video. I talked about Yuji and Ichigo's aversion to violence for the sake of violence, and that remains to be true. But it's also true that Yuji and Ichigo have been given very delinquent-like traits in their stories, and something about that is really funny. Gege is a pretty obvious and massive fan of Kubo, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if this was intentional on his part to make these two similar in that aspect. Yuji and Ichigo's hair, for example, being bright fluorescent colors is something that is not only common in anime, but also in Japanese culture somewhat implies that they are rebellious in nature, in spite of orange and pink both being their natural colors. Even with the delinquent gag though, Gege and Kubo keep their respective characters consistent with the overarching narrative for them, as we only see the two characters get violent for the sake of others. Way before getting Shinigami powers or becoming the vessel for the King of Curses, these two were nice, naturally protective people. The story just grants them the ability to expand the range of their character over time. The fact that both of them really have hands without their powers, though, is also pretty cool. And speaking of hands, Ichigo and Yuji stand out in a series that have very complex and unique abilities. In a world of Gojos, Kisuke's, Megumis, and Mayuris, Ichigo and Yuji look extremely simple in comparison. These two are the manga equivalent of having no bag. No dribble moves, no hezzy step back, no crazy layup package. They really just charge to the rim and dunk that shit. These two characters have such a shallow bag that would make Giannis proud. Yuji has hands with the occasional usage of Divergent Fist and Black Flash, and Ichigo's got sword slashes and Getsuga Tenshos. I like it, don't get me wrong, but man, is it funny to think about that in the context of their stories. They really don't have any hacks whatsoever, and with Yuji, this may change later down the line in the manga, as Gege has alluded to Yuji being able to develop Sukuna's technique later down the line, but as of right now, for 200 plus chapters of JJK in all of Bleach, have had the simplest of movesets. I know a lot of people don't really care for their simplistic abilities, but I think having the two main characters have to use their creativity and ingenuity in order to overcome techniques that are significantly better on paper is fun, and it can also act as a palate cleanser for the viewers whenever the fights in the series get a little too technical or too complex, and we just want to wash it down with some simplicity. If the average Bleach and JJK fight is a nice meal, it's a really and heavy filling one, and Ichigo and Yuji's relatively simple fighting styles act as a cool, refreshing beverage to wash down all of the complexity with. Very weird analogy, I know, but in manga like this, it's all about balance, and this is actually a writing trait that isn't limited to Kubo and Gege. Gon is also a protagonist that serves the exact same purpose. Anyone who's read Hunter x Hunter already knows how complex and detailed the power system is, but in spite of this, in spite of the fact that Togashi has the ability to write some of the most intricately interwoven fights in Shonen, he made Gon's Nen ability rock, paper, scissors. This is a choice that, intentional or not, means the reader can always expect some relief from ridiculously complex abilities and just see some people scrap. Maybe some think that Gege and Kubo didn't get this balance correct, and that is a discussion in and of itself, but I would say that Ichigo and Yuji fights are good enough on their own to be enjoyed in a vacuum, but they have the added benefit of switching things up at times when a reader may not want to see a bunch of Bankai or curse techniques that are complex. Sometimes I just want to see a big blast of energy, super speed, and martial arts in my battle manga, even if the stories are built around more complicated abilities. So the fact that these two characters are the primary mechanisms for me to get my simplicity fix is a surprisingly large contributing factor to what makes them so enjoyable. Yuji and Ichigo may be called bagless from time to time, but when their fights are some of the best in the entire series, it's kind of hard to say that that's a bad thing. But moving on to something with a little bit more substance to it, I'd like to talk about these two characters and how they personally respond to their antagonists. Many main characters do it differently or approach fighting a villain with a completely different ethos, but once again, Yuji and Ichigo's similarities shine when you look at this particular aspect of them. And the simplest way to put it is that they get led by the nose quite often by their antagonists. At the end of the day, Every main character has to be manipulated or influenced by their villains to some extent, but Ichigo and Yuji really get the short end of the stick in this department, and it's part of the reason that they are such interesting characters to read about. These two really get manipulated and mentally picked apart by their villains on a semi-regular basis, and it's kinda wild. For Ichigo, the main culprits of this are Aizen, Tsukishima, and Yuha. For Yuji, the main culprits are Mahito and Sukuna. They both face opponents that they can handle more straightforwardly, sure, but some of the greatest moments from Ichigo and Yuji come directly from chapters where they are just getting mentally body. Ichigo being told that his life was planned by Aizen, Sukuna ripping out his own heart and letting Yuji die, Ichigo having his family and friends turned against him, Yuji seeing Mahito kill Junpei, and so many more instances like this exist, and while they are almost always painful for the reader and for the characters, they also just happen to be great for the writing and for the narrative. Yuji and Ichigo are very steadfast characters, and they don't fall into despair so easily, so when Gege and Kubo really stack the odds against them enough to make them just lose all hope and resolve, you know that you are in a juicy part of the story, and you also know that something great is coming for them later. You can and should attribute a lot of this successful storytelling to their antagonists, by the way. This isn't all through Yuji and Ichigo's efforts alone, but they do benefit a lot from great characters like Aizen and Mahito continuously toying with them. They benefit both as characters and as people within their own world. They get knocked around so often by the story that sometimes you wonder if they can even get back up or ever come back from what they went through. Sometimes the answer is yes, but in a lot of cases, the answer is actually no. Sometimes they are broken to a point where they do fundamentally change, to a point where the character that was broken and discarded can almost be considered a completely different person to the one that came back into the story. Just like Ichigo Zanpakuto in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, he and Yuji can't always be fixed. Sometimes they must reforge their very being and come back as something entirely new. And this leads into what is, in my opinion, the greatest thing that these characters both do. Accept and grow. These three words encapsulate everything that I'm going to talk about in this portion of the video. All of the explaining, all of the analyzing, all of the examples given simply point back to that one phrase: accept and grow. This is what they are both able to do when confronted with the mental toying and manipulation that is present in the series. Now, I wanted to approach this video with as little spoilers for the JJK manga as possible, but when talking about conclusions to certain arcs concerning Yuji, it's almost impossible to do so without delving into spoiler territory, so be warned. From this point on, JJK spoilers are on the table. That being said, when taking a look at Yuji's story with Mahito and how his narrative with Sukuna seems to be playing out, I'd consider it akin to Ichigo's journey with Yuha and White. I know that within the context of Bleach, White isn't actually an enemy of Ichigo's, rather he is Ichigo himself, but earlier on in the story, he wasn't framed this way. He was framed as an unknown power within Ichigo that scared him, something he thought he had to suppress. Throughout the story though, those barriers slowly but surely get removed. It starts with Ichigo deciding to tame his power, and it progresses to him learning that the power he had been tapping into wasn't some separate entity, it was him all along. The power that he once feared, hated, and suppressed turned out to just be a part of himself. It was only after being tormented by his inability to accept reality that he realized ignoring part of his identity would not serve him in the long run. The same thing rings true for his Quinty heritage in relation to Yuha. Both of these things coalesced in The Blade is Me, and it's hailed as one of the best parts of Bleach, specifically because it was here when Kubo tied together some long-running themes and concepts for Ichigo. To compare to Jujutsu Kaisen, this is essentially his I am you speech. For Yuji, his acceptance of himself is a little bit less literal, but he found it through hardship all the same. In Shibuya, Mahito and Sukuna really put him through the ringer. Sukuna kills hundreds of innocent people while piloting his body, Mahito kills Nanami and Nobara while severely handicapping Todo. When going even broader than just Mahito and Sukuna's actions, we know that Gojo was sealed by Kenjaku, and Choso defeated Yuji even after he strengthened his resolve. Two of his teachers are gone, Nobara is dead, hundreds of civilians were erased, and he suffered a crushing defeat, all in one night. All happening before Mahito just piles on and calls Yuji out for his hypocrisy. I've talked about this moment in Mahito's speech to Yuji many times before, and I'm sure that you know how this story goes. After getting help from Todo and his resolve being reinvigorated, Yuji is able to defeat Mahito, but before he does so, he acknowledges him as right. The hypocrisy that Yuji had been living in before is recognized, and he is able to admit that he and Mahito are the same. The cursed spirit that he hates more than almost anything in the world was correct about them being two sides of the same coin. He wanted to reject this horrible idea just like Ichigo, but in Jujutsu Kaisen, strength comes through acceptance, and Yuji needed that strength now more than ever in order to defeat his greatest foe. In the face of hopelessness, in the face of despair, Ichigo and Yuji can fail, they can waver, and they do many times in the series. Gege and Kubo both make it a point to show that they are human enough to completely fall apart sometimes. How they continue moving forward in spite of their despair is why we love Yuji and Ichigo. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more like it, check out my other videos where I talked about why we love a specific character. I've done quite a few with Bleach and JJK characters specifically, and if there is one you'd like to see me talk about that I haven't already, let me know down in the comments. I got a couple more JJK and Bleach bangers for y'all soon, so subscribe to see those come out later. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.